Smoke, silence, and the weight of a name. In the restless heart of New York City, where ambition moved faster than the trains beneath the pavement, BumpyJohnson had long ago learned that survival did not belong to the loudest man in the room. It belonged to the calmest. Harlem knew him not just as a figure of influence, but as a paradox, sharp yet restrained, feared yet strangely admired. His presence carried weight, but his silence carried more. On a cold evening that smelled faintly of rain and cigar smoke, the streets hummed with rumors. Word had reached him that Vito Genovese was back in town. Not in the public sense, not with headlines or spectacle, but in whispers, the kind that traveled from bartender to bookmaker, from driver to doorman. In that world, whispers were louder than gunshots. Bumpy sat at a polished wooden table inside a quiet Harlem club. The piano in the corner played a low, thoughtful melody. He watched the room not as a predator, but as a student. Every glance, every movement, every shift in posture told a story. He believed that men revealed themselves in moments of comfort, not chaos. Across town, Vito Genovese was known for a different kind of power, calculated, ruthless, efficient. His reputation was built on precision. He was not a man who made public threats. He preferred strategy, and strategy, Bumpy knew, was far more dangerous than rage. The invitation arrived without flourish, a meeting, neutral ground, no theatrics. Just a conversation between two men who understood the currency of territory and influence. The message was simple: let's talk. Bumpy studied the paper before folding it neatly into his pocket. He did not rush to respond. He understood something many did not. Reaction was weakness. Timing was power. The next evening, the club was quieter than usual. The bartender polished glasses that were already spotless. A faint tension lingered in the air like a coming storm. Vito Genovese entered not with noise, but with certainty. His suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable. They greeted each other not as enemies, but as seasoned players in a long game. "Harlem suits you," Vito said, his voice smooth. "Harlem belongs to itself," Bumpy replied calmly. They sat. Drinks were poured. Words were measured. But Bumpy noticed something subtle, a flicker in the eyes of the waiter, a hand that lingered a fraction too long near his glass. It wasn't panic. It was something else. Pressure. In that world, pressure meant someone was being forced to choose. Bumpy did not drink. Instead, he lifted the glass slowly, holding it at eye level. The amber liquid caught the light beautifully. He swirled it, studied it, then set it back down untouched. Vito watched him carefully. "Something wrong?" he asked. Bumpy's lips curved slightly. "You ever wonder why some men rush?" he said softly. "It's because they're afraid silence will expose them." The room felt smaller. Bumpy signaled to the waiter, calm, controlled. "Switch them," he said evenly. The waiter froze. Vito's expression tightened just for a second, but in that second, truth surfaced. Bumpy wasn't interested in spectacle. He was interested in awareness, in accountability, in forcing a man to confront his own decision. "Gentlemen," Bumpy continued, his tone never rising, "if we're here to talk, we talk. If we're here to test each other, then let's be honest about it." No one moved. The glasses remained where they were. And in that stillness, something powerful happened. Not violence, not chaos, but exposure. The illusion of control shifted. Vito understood that Bumpy was not reacting emotionally. He was reading the room, calculating, waiting. Vito leaned back slightly. "You think I'd need tricks?" he asked. "I think," Bumpy said, meeting his gaze, "that men who underestimate silence often reveal more than they intend." The piano stopped playing. The waiter quietly removed both glasses without switching them. The message was clear without being spoken. There would be no drink that night, no rash move, no public humiliation. But there was a realization. BumpyJohnson was not a man easily cornered. He did not rely on fear, he relied on perception. And perception, when sharpened with patience, was more dangerous than any weapon. As Vito stood to leave, he paused. "You're careful," he said. "I'm disciplined." The door closed behind Vito and Harlem exhaled. But Bumpy did not celebrate, because he knew something deeper. When a man attempts to test you quietly and fails, he doesn't walk away embarrassed. He walks away planning. Bumpy stepped outside into the cool night air. The streetlights flickered softly. Somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted from an apartment window. Life went on. He adjusted his coat and looked down the street. Power wasn't proven in loud confrontations. It was proven in moments when temptation, ego, and pride tried to provoke you, and you chose restraint instead. This was not over, not by a long shot. But the first move had been made, and BumpyJohnson had made it without raising his voice.
The night after the meeting did not explode into headlines or sirens, and that was precisely what unsettled BumpyJohnson the most. In Harlem, noise was often a distraction, but silence, prolonged, deliberate silence, was preparation. He walked the streets of his neighborhood the following morning without entourage or announcement, greeting shopkeepers, nodding to mothers guiding their children to school, pausing outside the bookstore he favored. To many, he was simply a familiar presence, a man who belonged to the rhythm of the blocks. Yet behind the calm exterior, his mind moved with disciplined precision. The attempted test from Vito Genovese had not been about a drink, it had been about leverage, about signaling dominance without open confrontation. And when leverage failed, strategy evolved. Bumpy understood that true strength in a fragile ecosystem like Harlem did not come from intimidation alone. It came from stability. The people who lived there were not chess pieces. They were families who depended on predictable peace. If outside forces disturbed that balance, fear would ripple through the community, and fear eroded trust. Trust, once fractured, was far harder to restore than territory. So instead of responding with retaliation or threats, Bumpy did something that confused his rivals. He invested in visibility. He attended community gatherings, quietly funded repairs for a church roof, ensured local businesses felt protected rather than pressured. He strengthened the root so deeply that any attempt to uproot him would meet resistance not from violence, but from unity. Meanwhile, across the river, Genovese recalibrated. His reputation had been built on swift, efficient dominance. Being subtly challenged in a public setting without direct confrontation was not humiliation, it was a complication. He respected intelligence, but he disliked unpredictability. Bumpy's refusal to drink had not embarrassed him, it had denied him control. That denial lingered in his thoughts. For a man accustomed to authority, denial was a kind of echo that refused to fade. Weeks passed with no overt moves. Rumors swirled, contracts shifted hands quietly, alliances were tested in private conversations, yet no visible spark ignited. Observers might have mistaken it for peace, but it was the stillness of two seasoned strategists studying one another. Bumpy spent long evenings reading, reflecting, and meeting with trusted confidants. He spoke little about the incident itself. Instead, he asked questions about supply chains, about loyalty, about pressure points that existed far beyond the obvious. He understood that battles were rarely won at the scene of provocation. They were won in the groundwork laid long before. One evening, as jazz drifted softly from a Harlem club and laughter mingled with cigarette smoke, Bumpy received quiet confirmation that Genovese had begun tightening his circle. New faces were appearing in familiar places. Conversations stopped when certain doors opened. The pattern was clear. Influence was being tested in subtler ways, contracts redirected, intermediaries persuaded, small disruptions introduced to measure reaction. But Bumpy did not react. He adapted. He shifted responsibilities quietly, diversified alliances, ensured no single connection held too much weight. His strategy was not confrontation, but diffusion. If pressure came from one direction, he allowed it to dissipate rather than collide. The goal was never to prove dominance through spectacle. It was to render dominance unnecessary. This approach confused many younger men who expected immediate retaliation. They mistook patience for weakness. Bumpy gathered them one evening and spoke not with fire, but with clarity. He explained that discipline was a shield. When provoked, the instinct was to respond loudly, but a loud response often revealed vulnerabilities. Silence, when chosen intentionally, forced the opponent to question their assumptions. Doubt was a more effective weapon than anger. Genovese, for his part, began to realize that this was not a contest of intimidation. It was a contest of endurance. Each waited for the other to misstep. Each measured resources, alliances, and resolve. Yet beneath the calculated maneuvers lay a deeper truth neither could ignore. The community was watching. Harlem's stability was the true prize, and any overt clash would damage more than reputations. The tension reached a new height when a shipment meant for Harlem was quietly delayed under questionable circumstances. It was not an act of aggression, but it was a test. Would Bumpy interpret it as a direct challenge? Would he retaliate? Instead, he responded with negotiation. He traced the source of the delay, confronted the intermediaries calmly, and resolved the disruption without escalation. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Control could not be seized through indirect pressure. Genovese observed this carefully. What unsettled him was not that Bumpy resisted, it was that he resisted without hostility. There was no public accusation, no dramatic display, only quiet correction. That kind of steadiness was difficult to destabilize. As autumn deepened and the air sharpened, a mutual understanding began to emerge. Neither man would concede ground, but neither would risk open conflict that endangered broader interests. The attempted test with the glass had evolved into something larger, a psychological contest where discipline outweighed theatrics. Yet underneath the surface, unresolved tension lingered, because in worlds built on power, coexistence is fragile. It requires constant recalibration, constant vigilance. Bumpy knew that peace without preparation was naivete, so he strengthened his inner circle not through fear, but through loyalty earned by fairness. He reinforced his role not as a tyrant, but as a stabilizer. In the quiet of his study one night, he reflected on the deeper lesson. The razor-sharp edge of a man's character was not revealed when he dominated others. It was revealed when he restrained himself, despite having the capacity to escalate. True resilience was not loud, it was measured. The first confrontation had not ended in chaos, it had ended in clarity. And clarity in their world was more powerful than any dramatic gesture. But patience has a cost, and both men were calculating how long they were willing to pay it.
The power that isn't shown. Winter settled over New York City with a cold that seemed to sharpen every edge of the city. Snow gathered along the sidewalks of Harlem, muting the usual noise, turning the streets into reflective corridors of white. In that quiet, strategy deepened. BumpyJohnson understood that influence was not something you displayed, it was something you demonstrated through consistency. The attempted maneuver from Vito Genovese had transformed into a silent rivalry, defined not by confrontation, but by who could maintain equilibrium longer. Bumpy's greatest asset was not fear, it was predictability. His allies knew his principles. He did not make impulsive decisions. He did not abandon those who remained loyal. That reliability built a foundation stronger than intimidation ever could. Meanwhile, Genovese's network thrived on efficiency and calculated expansion. He respected order, but he also respected outcomes. If an opponent could not be destabilized, perhaps coexistence offered greater returns than conflict. An unexpected opportunity emerged when mutual interests required coordination. A larger external pressure, regulatory scrutiny, and shifting alliances beyond their immediate spheres forced both sides to consider collaboration rather than competition. It was not friendship, it was pragmatism. Meetings resumed, this time without the subtle theatrics of the earlier encounter. There were no suspicious glances toward glasses, no quiet tests. Instead, there was a shared understanding that escalation benefited no one. In one particularly pivotal discussion, held in a discreet midtown office far from Harlem's familiar streets, Bumpy articulated something that shifted the dynamic entirely. He spoke not of territory or dominance, but of sustainability. He argued that influence maintained through stability lasted longer than influence seized through force. He framed restraint as strategy, not weakness. Genovese listened carefully. He recognized logic when he heard it. What neither man admitted openly was that both had learned from the initial encounter. The attempted manipulation had revealed not vulnerability, but character. Bumpy's refusal to react impulsively had earned a reluctant respect. Genovese's recalibration, instead of reckless retaliation, signaled intelligence. In another era, in another environment, their rivalry might have exploded into spectacle. But in this moment, it evolved into cautious equilibrium. Harlem felt the shift before anyone announced it. Tension eased subtly. Business resumed its steady cadence. The community, though unaware of every behind-the-scenes calculation, sensed that stability had prevailed. And stability, in neighborhoods accustomed to uncertainty, was a rare gift. One late evening, as snow melted into thin streams along the curb, Bumpy stood outside the same club where the first encounter had taken place. The piano music drifted again through the doorway, softer now, almost reflective. He thought about how close the situation could have come to unnecessary chaos. A single impulsive decision might have triggered a chain reaction impossible to control. Instead, discipline had redirected the narrative. The legend that would later circulate about razors and forced humiliation was just that, a legend shaped by the human appetite for drama. The truth was quieter, more powerful. The confrontation had not been resolved through spectacle, it had been resolved through composure. Bumpy adjusted his coat and stepped inside, greeting familiar faces. Power did not need to be proven repeatedly, it needed to be exercised wisely. The razor edge in this story was not steel, it was restraint. In worlds defined by dominance, the strongest move is often the one not made. And in that winter of calculated silence, two formidable figures recognized that survival depended not on who could intimidate the other, but on who could master themselves. The rivalry did not vanish, it transformed, and sometimes transformation is the greatest victory of all.
Legacy is louder than revenge. By the time spring returned to New York City, the sharp winter tension that once hovered between BumpyJohnson and Vito Genovese had evolved into something more complex than rivalry. It was no longer a question of who could unsettle the other. It had become a test of who understood the long game. The city itself was shifting. Economic currents, political scrutiny, and generational change were reshaping the undercurrents of power. In such an environment, impulsive dominance was not strength, it was liability. Both men knew this, even if they never spoke it aloud. For Bumpy, the lesson of that first night, the quiet refusal, the untouched glass, the silent recalibration, had crystallized into philosophy. He began mentoring younger men in his circle with a different tone than before. Instead of glorifying toughness, he emphasized discipline. Instead of encouraging reaction, he encouraged awareness.
He told them that reputation built on fear required constant reinforcement, but reputation built on reliability required only consistency. Harlem's stability had become his proving ground. When schools needed support, he ensured they received it quietly. When disputes between local businesses threatened to escalate, he mediated with patience. He reinforced the idea that power was not measured by how many people stepped aside when you entered a room, but by how many felt secure when you stayed. Across town, Genovese was navigating his own recalibration. The attempted psychological maneuver that once aimed to test Bumpy had unintentionally revealed something else. Control was not absolute. There were men who could not be pressured into mistakes. Rather than allowing ego to dominate strategy, Genovese chose pragmatism. He began to shift focus outward, expanding his operations in directions that avoided direct friction with Harlem's internal structure. It was not surrender, it was redirection. In high-stakes environments, redirection often accomplished more than confrontation. What made this period remarkable was not a dramatic showdown, but the absence of one. Rumors of razors and retaliation continued to circulate in corners of the city, growing more embellished with each retelling. Stories traveled faster than facts. In some versions, Bumpy had humiliated his rival publicly. In others, Genovese had narrowly avoided disaster. But the man at the center of those tales understood that the truth was less theatrical and far more instructive. The razor people imagined was never drawn. The real edge was internal, the sharp line between impulse and control. One evening, months after the initial tension, the two men found themselves at a larger gathering hosted by mutual associates. The atmosphere was measured but not hostile. Conversations flowed, deals were discussed, and the city's shifting landscape dominated the dialogue. At one point, their eyes met across the room. There was no animosity in the glance, only recognition. Recognition that each had tested the other and found discipline instead of recklessness. In that recognition lay a quiet respect. Bumpy reflected later that night on how easily pride could have redirected his path. A single reactive decision might have escalated into open conflict, drawing attention, destabilizing communities, and weakening both sides. Instead, restraint had fortified his standing. Harlem had not suffered for the sake of ego. That mattered more than any dramatic gesture. He understood something fundamental. Legacy was built not in explosive moments, but in the accumulation of wise choices. Genovese, too, carried his own conclusions. He had seen enough men crumble under pressure to know that unpredictability was dangerous, but there was something uniquely formidable about predictability grounded in principle. It created a foundation that rivals could not easily fracture. Over time, this realization altered his calculations. Rather than attempting to destabilize Harlem's structure, he began exploring collaborative opportunities where interests aligned. It was not friendship, but it was equilibrium, a delicate balance forged not by force, but by mutual recognition of limits. As the year unfolded, Harlem flourished in subtle ways. Businesses stabilized, community tensions eased. The absence of spectacle became the true victory. Bumpy continued to walk the streets without unnecessary fanfare, greeting neighbors, listening more than speaking. His influence endured not because he demanded acknowledgement, but because he embodied steadiness. People trusted him not to ignite chaos for the sake of pride. That trust became his most valuable asset. In the quiet of his study one late night, Bumpy considered the myth that had begun to surround that first confrontation. He understood why people preferred dramatic narratives. A razor drawn in defiance made for a better story than a glass left untouched. But he knew the deeper truth. Courage was not always loud.
Sometimes courage was the refusal to escalate when escalation felt justified. Sometimes the strongest move was to deny your opponent the reaction they sought. The rivalry that once simmered beneath the surface of New York City did not disappear entirely. Competitive spirits rarely vanish, but it matured into something more calculated and less volatile. Each man recognized that survival in a complex world required adaptability. Pride, if left unchecked, consumed empires. Discipline preserved them. Years later, when people spoke about Bumpy Johnson, they often highlighted his resilience, his strategic mind, and his composure under pressure. Few understood that one of his greatest victories occurred not in a blaze of drama, but in a moment of restraint that prevented unnecessary destruction. The razor in the legend symbolized something intangible, the edge of self-control. Legacy, he realized, was louder than revenge. Revenge created noise, legacy created continuity, and continuity outlasted even the most sensational stories. As spring evenings warmed Harlem once more, the piano in the corner club played on, softer and steadier than before. The city continued its restless rhythm, and in that rhythm, two powerful figures had learned an uncommon lesson. In a world obsessed with proving strength, the rarest strength of all was mastery over oneself.